Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, and I am here today with Penny Nass of the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, and the group Trade Experts. And we are joined by Nicolas Poitier from Bruegel. We're going to talk to you about trade. Penny, there's a lot going on right now. Can you set the scene for people where we stand in terms of Washington, Europe, and Beijing? We're looking at car tariffs. We're looking at a lot of concern about the green transition, industrial subsidies. Like, how do we get our heads around where we are?
Let's kind of start with where we are in the world, I think. So you've got a couple of big kind of tectonic shifts that are going on in the world today. First is the issues around climate change, which then trigger an energy transition. And by an energy transition, we're also talking about changes in manufacturing industries and industries in general as we move from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that's based on new, more renewable forms of energy. You couple that with the digitalization that's going on in the world today and the technology. Again, really transformational for societies and for industries, and in particular for service industries, as some of these new technologies that are coming online will really impact how we operate, again, kind of across our economies. And then last, as all of these changes are going on, these kind of reindustrialization that's going to be driven by both the climate change, energy transition, as well as the technology, you have geopolitical shifts that are going on. And countries competing for their piece of what will be the industries, the next generation of industries that we're going to see, as well as how do we protect our societies? How do we fund our societies? How do we do all these things? So we're really at this important point in history. We're on the cusp of these enormous transformations, this incredible transformation that's going on in the world. And then how do governments, as well as societies, react to all these changes that are going on? So that's kind of just to like lay the groundwork for kind of the big trends that I think that are overarching here. And so I think some of the things you've just referenced, Rebecca, and maybe we start with the electric vehicles. So if you take what we were just talking about, or what I was just talking about, and you look at the climate change energy transition, the electric vehicle issue is just fundamental. The car has been fundamental to both the US and the European economies for decades. Not only important from a transportation perspective, but incredibly important from an employment, a manufacturing and industrialization, as well as regional policy perspective. And China, back in, I think almost 20 years ago, started prioritizing electric vehicles as an industry of the future that it wanted to invest in. So according to the Kiel Institute of World Economy, they've invested something like 3 to 8 times the subsidies that the US and Europe have put into this sector, trying to make the electric vehicle a hallmark of their future industrialization. And so we're now seeing that we're now at the tip of the spear on that with regards to that industry coming online in China in a way that is overwhelming world markets. And I think you see both the US and the European governments reacting to those circumstances and wanting to, one, protect, and they use the word protect, their investments, those industries, and those jobs in their countries, while also ensuring that all citizens see that the green transition is something that's not a negative, but a positive. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much for giving us an entry point to how to think about this, and particularly the issue of the cars, because the US makes cars, Europe makes cars, China makes cars, and it's a really evocative industry for looking at whether people are trading openly with their peers, whether they want to give a boost to their producers at home, and how they want to balance questions of economic security and economic resilience. Now, Nicholas, we talked about this earlier on this show. We talked about economic resilience, making sure that your supply chain is diversified in case you can't get to somebody because of a political disagreement or a natural disaster. And we've also talked about protecting yourself from people whose strategic interests are different from yours, either for national security reasons or because you really want to protect part of your economy. So, where are we now? Are we in active protection mode? Are we trying to have the best of all worlds? Like, what is the deal? The US has done big tariffs. The EU is looking at medium sized tariffs. China is looking at doing tariffs in response to all of these things. How do we sort through it?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, Rebecca. It's a pleasure, as always. I think we have to distinguish a little bit the rationale between the different types of tariffs that we see, because I think there are important differences between what the Europeans are doing and what the Americans are doing. I think in the American case, there is a strong element to this, which is basically just the kind of buyer's remorse that part of the American establishment has from just trade openness. And we see a retreat that maybe started during Obama, but certainly was very strong push during the Trump administration from global trade, a strong protectionist agenda that has continued into the Biden administration. And the American climate policy legislation, the headline legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, could only be passed by basically including a very strong anti-China element in there and a very strong protectionist element in there. And this means basically that now we have these EV tariffs, which are basically framed as punitive tariffs against China. So we have now 100% tariff on imports from Chinese EVs into the US. And these are not justified by any kind of market consideration in the EV industry itself. Rather, they're framed and they're justified as a measure of putting pressure on China to change its policies with regards to cyber theft of technologies and IP regulation and other things when what the US calls forced technology transfers. On the European space, it's somewhat different. I think also here there are, of course, interests of certain automotive companies in protecting their European production from Chinese competition, but that's not the main rationale of these tariffs. Indeed, parts of the automotive industry, which is heavily invested in China itself, have lobbied strongly against these tariffs. Instead, this is kind of a political element of the European Commission trying to get, on the one hand, a stronger policy towards Chinese subsidies in general, but also to some extent protecting the production in Europe against some of the effects of Chinese industrial policy spilling over. So the European tariffs, unlike the US tariffs, are actually justified based on the market condition, the competition effects that these industrial policies have for the European markets. So I think the two things that, even though they look very similar in their nature and in their intent, they're very different. And I think also because the size of the tariffs is also different, they will have very different effects on the markets.
Penny, you have lived in Washington and in Brussels, and you have worked in the Commerce Department in the US. Do you agree with that, or how do you see it differently?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with that. I think that when you think about trade, and I go way back to when we were taught that trade was about comparative advantage and I make guns, you make butter, and we are going to exchange our products and specialize. Now, the one thing that I don't remember being taught was that you kind of need to trust your partner if you're the guy selling them guns, because they can turn around and use those guns against you. So trust between trading partners in that circumstance is something that I think has been, I think it was usually mutual dependence that people focused on as opposed to trust. And I think where we are is we're moving towards a world where we're going to be looking for trusted partners, trusted people that we can trade with. And why I start with that, and why I think the G7 has been talking about this trustworthiness initiative, is because I think, going to Nicholas's point, if you're sitting in Europe and you're looking at the US versus looking at China, depending on the outcome of the US election, I think that there's some European countries that may not necessarily see the US as the trustworthy ally that it used to. And so as a result, I think that there's a lot of elements in play in kind of the European decision, that potentially being one, differences in their supply chains and dependence on China another, different relationships overall. I think is coloring some of that. Now, the EU went through a very formal, countervailing duty investigation, looked very specifically at the policies and procedures and calculated what were specific amounts for 3 specific companies, and all other rate for people who participated. And I think Tesla has requested a separate duty rate for themselves as well. So it was a much more formal process under the countervailing duty laws that looked very specifically at benefits that would have been given to the car companies and impacted what they were selling in Europe. Whereas the US, I think, went more for a blanket approach, using, again, Nicholas is right, using a different law, the 301 tariff, which comes out of the 1974 Trade Act. And it's something that we used a lot before the WTO. We're going back and starting to use it again, and it is much more of a blunt instrument. But I'm not sure it's necessarily premised on the tech transfer and the IPR. It's more of a blunt instrument to use to provide that protection for U.S. industry in this period. But again, I think it's a difference in terms of how you see the world. So with that, I agree with Nicholas. There are some differences, but at the end of the day, it is about, how to create the room and the space for our two economies in a world where the Chinese really are have put a lot of resources into this, to the point that it's clear that they've got massive overcapacity coming online in this sector that will swamp the rest of the world and negatively impact industries and workers if this continues.
How do we get our hands around the idea of overcapacity when China is making a lot of stuff that the world needs and arguably might want to buy cheaply so that it could electrify more quickly? And we certainly have had Bruegel colleagues make the argument that EU should focus on deployment and upgrades and not so much on trying to compete on manufacturing the same widgets.
As an economist, I sometimes struggle with this notion of overcapacity because it doesn't really have a proper economic definition in the way that we might want to, would like to see. So I think the way it is used in this context, the term overcapacity means basically exports to the detriment of alternative trading partner. And here I think especially what is very problematic for foreign producers is just the scale and the volume of products that suddenly come out on the market and therefore kind of squeeze out other producers from the market. And I think here the goals, and I think there the EU and US, the difference between EU and US strategy are kind of, the differences are interesting, is that on the one hand, this is nothing bad. We would like to see many EVs being produced. More EVs on the markets pushes down prices, which will increase adoption and therefore accelerate the green transition. It has, of course, consequences if this happens at the speed that the domestic producers cannot adapt to and therefore might squeeze out domestic producers. But in the European mindset and the European policy set, this by itself is not the argument for why we need these subsidies. Because you cannot really argue this being the case right now, because actually right now the volumes are not very high. It's just the anticipation of very high volumes that lead to this policy response. So instead of something that is really like in the classical overcapacity case, what the European Commission at least is saying is, we don't know, the volumes might not be there yet, but we already know that the subsidies itself are there. And these are market distorting, so we can act on a competition basis, even though we might not have some kind of dumping case right now because prices are actually higher in Europe than in China.
So the Chinese are providing most of the subsidies, but as you pointed out, the US is also doing subsidies too. And Europe, should we expect to see a lot more subsidies in Europe? Is everybody just going to start pouring money into the sector?
So this is really the risk. We see this basically an acceleration of subsidies on all sides. We saw this Inflation Reduction Act. We see this basically on the European reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act, where there was already like a big subsidy discussion going on in Europe at the time, but there was a big push towards scaling the European subsidies and creating new kind of subsidy tools at the time the IRA was passed. One of these ideas, and I think a very dangerous idea, was aid mirroring. That basically you could allow aid of an equivalent size to those given by other countries to be justified towards companies. This is, of course, very problematic basically because it means windfall profits for these companies. They will produce factories that they already had planned to produce, and then they get the subsidy and the public sees no benefit of this. It's also problematic, especially in the case of EVs, that it is, if you look at the climate technologies that we have, batteries and EV technology are actually quite well established, and we can see a clear path to commercialization and to them being commercially competitive without subsidies to conventional ICE cars, which we still don't see in other technologies. So we would rather, from a public policy standpoint, we would rather see subsidies in areas where we don't have commercially viable technologies. So this kind of focus on actually subsidies for production is very problematic from this case. But it's also problematic because it creates trade tensions. We see this in the EU-China case, where EU and China will have now a tit for tat, a little trade war around this, likely about these subsidies and the countervailing duties. But there's also cases where maybe in the future we also see this between the EU and US, because the US IRA subsidies are WTO incompliant in a very blatant way that would allow the EU actually to to act against some of them if they wanted to. Right now, because of the Biden administration being somewhat nice to the Europeans and making some exemption here and there, the Europeans are willing to kind of swallow that. But if we would see large scales exports of subsidized U.S. production to Europe, we might also see an Airbus Boeing type trade war on green subsidies in the transatlantic trade relationship.
Interesting you pick on Airbus Boeing because that went back and forth in many directions for many years. ICE is internal combustion engine, if I recall, and that's the old-fashioned put the gas or the diesel in the car kind. When we come back, we'll talk more about the WTO and where that stands now. Penny, you have seen the WTO go through a lot of iterations. Is it still a thing now? We hear that the process is broken, that the panels are broken, and that even though China and more people are now World Trade Organization members, that the system just isn't working. And Nicholas has just said that many of the current industrial policy initiatives by many of the major players probably would not pass muster. What's going on?
I'll start by saying I'm a big believer in the WTO. I believe that it still remains a very effective and one of the few functioning international fora where a lot of issues are discussed and where people can come together in a constructive way and discuss things. Some elements of it have not worked as initially intended. It's having its 30th year anniversary. And with a couple of smaller exceptions, it has not been able to live up to its ability to negotiate new agreements, to kind of keep the trade rules moving forward, to advance things that reflect the economy we have today. The economy we have today is different than the global economy we had 5 years ago, much less what we had 30 years ago. And so to think about where global trade is going and have an organization that can at least talk about these things, even if it can't legislate them, remains important. But I think that there are things, it is a member-driven organization. And I think that there are some members that have lost interest or lost faith in the WTO as a means to address all of its concerns. And in particular, I think it's the big ones. It's the U.S. becoming a bit disillusioned as a result of China's entry and the feeling that China has been able to game the system a bit. That is something that I think the U.S., as I recently heard Catherine Tai say, she believes the WTO needs love, but it also needs some reform. And she describes the WTO as a much loved institution, but one that the U.S., I think, would like to see some changes made to. So I think it still remains quite a relevant body. It remains quite a relevant space for a lot of technical discussions. I would just remind people to look at what's happened to the UK post-Brexit and to see what would happen if the WTO, which is the basis of like 90% of global trade, suddenly stopped. I think we have an example in Europe and in the UK that provides some ideas of what happens when you dramatically change the trade rules overnight, and the dislocation and disruption that creates. And so I think that the WTO remains an institution that folks should focus on. I will say that I don't think anything regarding the WTO is a huge vote getter in most places. And I would say that both in the United States and Europe, I'm not sure anybody's going to campaign on a WTO issue, but it remains one of those really important institutions that underpins our daily life. And without it, we would suddenly see very dramatic changes. We might not be able to point our finger at it, but it would be the reason why some of those incredible changes would take place.
Let's spend a little more time on the U.S. situation. You mentioned Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade representative. President Joe Biden, it seems to me, has been less of a free trader than many of his predecessors, perhaps in reaction to the Donald Trump administration and the forthcoming rematch with Trump. How can we look at the state of Congress and its gridlock over everything, as well as foreign policy, and the mood in the White House, and get a sense of where the U.S. is standing now? Because it seems to me it's pretty dramatically changed But it's hard for me to tease out where the key points were.
So where are things? I think it's been I would call it an evolution, not a revolution in some sense, where we stand on trade policy. But I do think that there are changes that have taken place whereby folks have looked at the past 50, 60 years of trade liberalization. And in the United States, have said there is a subset of the US population that has not benefited from trade in the way that's been promised. And we need to rethink the neoliberal trade order and come up with a new way that serves everybody, but particularly those that had been left behind better than the previous system. I think we're at the cusp of that. I think there's a lot of work going on in terms of defining what the next trade system will be. Some want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think there are others that that believe that there are tweaks that can be made to the system that would improve it, and that it was other policies that maybe contributed to some of the concerns that have been raised. So I think that this is coming through very strongly in both the Trump and the Biden administration. I think they're symptoms, not necessarily of general concern that I think citizens have in the world today, with regards to the incredible amount of change that's going on. Going back to how I opened, the world is changing so fast, so quickly. It's hard to tell your kids what to study at university. It's hard to figure out where we're going to be headed. And I think that uncertainty and that lack of clarity for many people, the job you have, you're probably not going to have the same job for 40 years. Your life is going to, you may have to go back to school. Things are just going to really be very different over the next 40, 50 years than they were in the past 40, 50. And I think that's incredibly challenging. And I think we're grappling with some of those issues. And I think that that's what the Biden administration reflects in a large way. Again, that's kind of a quasi-economic view combined with some psychology and general observations, none of which is based on science, but kind of a sense of it.
Sure, but how much of this do you think would be different if we had a more functional Congress?
Congress is supposed to be the body in charge of foreign trade. And they have given up some of that right. They've given up the rights on tariffs. They've given up the rights on other things. I'm not clear it would actually be much better if we had a functional Congress. It could be, but it seems to me that some of what's being reflected by the former president, the current president, our two presidential candidates, is also reflected in the Congress. I mean, you can see this incredible focus on China coming out of Congress, driven largely by Congress. And, that's, I think, quite a big issue. But there are pockets within the Congress of folks who want to work on things like digital trade and who want to work on some of the other issues that are out there that have largely been ignored because we've been focused on the manufacturing industry when services is such a much larger part of our economy in the United States, and something that we need to keep an eye on. And frankly, that technology could impact much more dramatically than some of these other things have been impacting the manufacturing sector. So I think there are pockets, but I'm not sure that if Congress was playing its rightful role, we would be necessarily getting different results.
Thanks. And you make a great point about services versus manufacturing. Nicholas, in Brussels, we certainly have seen that since Brexit, all of the conversation seems to be about the transatlantic relationship and very little about the trans-channel relationship. What's your take on how that's gone?
We're now basically on the cusp of a British election, so I think it's a good time to talk about this. But my sense is there's just a lot of Brexit fatigue in Brussels. People had this very, very long, very, very tedious and difficult negotiations. And the outcome is somewhat palpable. It's okay for Europe. UK is not as important to Europe than Europe is to the UK. And I think there's very little appetite in Brussels to reopen this discussion, unless they see really a significant change in the UK itself. So I think there's this big question here. I think the reason there's two reasons. One is just the US is such a much more important market and just in the size of it. But the other one is just we had Brexit was in 2016 and it was not until 2020 when we had actual conclusion of some of these negotiations. So it was 4 years of this, and I think it's at the end of it, after negotiating the minutiae of fishery regulation, everyone was just a bit tired of it. Now, how much scope is there for basically forward negotiation. I think it's a bit to be seen for the new Labour government that is likely to come in. But a lot of the same sticking point, a lot of the same red lines might prevail. So I think there is much more concern about US direction than is about UK direction. UK is still in spirit, still very much committed to the WTO in the way the US is not. So I don't hold my breath for like revolutionary changes here.
Did you feel like the EU UK dispute over rules of origin and possible car manufacturing tariffs set the stage for where we are with China now?
I'm not so sure. I think that the difference in the EU stance towards China comes from two ways. The first one is basically the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That this notion of Wandel durch Handel, what the Germans always say, change through trade, that you just economic interdependence will lead to liberalization of a country and to peace and democrat and the rise of democracy. This belief was shattered by Russia's aggression against Ukraine, where basically the German government heavily invested into this relationship. They built a gas pipeline. The Americans have been telling them, and everyone else, not just the Americans, has been telling them it's a stupid idea. And this interdependence has gotten the Germans nothing, but basically that they're being blackmailed by the Russians. So there's basically a lot of concern that we run into the same issue with China, that we might, even though relations might be tenuous, but still well in economic terms at the moment, that there might be some kind of crazy foreign policy that we might see coming out of China that will suddenly change the page, and we will regret the economic integration we have right now. I think that is one of the key factors here, that the perception of Europe of the role that foreign policy and the interdependence with economic policy has really changed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The second factor is the change in US policy. We have long had China embracing industrial policy in a way that might not always been comfortable to Europe, but it was fine in a way. Like Europe has issues there, but also we made got a lot of benefits from China with China. But now that the US has basically become Chinese in its industrial policy, or at least attempts to be Chinese in industrial policy, there is a big concern that we have a breakdown in the mechanisms of international trade. So the important idea, or the great idea about multilateral trading system, is that basically trade is like a prisoner's dilemma. Every individual has an incentive to put tariffs on the export of their trading partners to basically increase the relative value of their own exports relative to these goods and improve that trading situation. But if everyone does that, you end up in a much poorer world where you have a lot of trade barriers. And there was this insight that actually would all benefit, the entire pie would grow if everyone together reduce all the trade barriers, and we have basically a richer world for everyone. And we have, the WTO gave us a coordination mechanism through which basically everyone agreed to lower the tariffs, and there was mechanisms that would ensure that these tariffs will stay low. Subsidies are in a way kind of the equivalent of tariffs on the other side. Through government subsidies, you can do the same effect as with tariffs. Now, China never really fully subscribed to that. Basically, you always use subsidies in the same way that one might have used tariffs in the past to promote their own export of the expense of imports and exports from other countries. But now we seeing US doing the same. And there's this big question mark, basically, whether this consensus, this positive sum view of the world's positive sum trading system might just disintegrate, because the two biggest players in the world don't believe in it anymore and pursuing zero-sum beggar thy neighbor policies. This is the big concern out of Europe. And that means also that Europe has kind of to adjust a bit more involved in defensive trade policy than it has been in the past. However, this negative picture, I would like to give a bit of a positive spin, not to be all gloomy. I think the reality is that still 90% of the acquis of the WTO, 90% of the treaties, everyone still agrees on them. So basically, even the US, that is probably the country that is most upset about the WTO, really is upset about a few parts of it. They don't like the dispute settlement system. They don't like the subsidy rules. They don't like basically that they cannot do very little against Chinese fulfillment of their obligations. But basically, 90% of the tariff reduction, I don't think the US really wants to unravel, at least with the current administration. Let's see about then what's happened in November. At the same time, there's 164 members in the WTO, and 162 members of the WTO are really still very much committed to the WTO. It's basically only the US and China that really have an issue here. They have an issue with each other, and the US has an issue with the WTO as a whole. But the rest of the group still pretty much believe in the system and support the system in its current form. So I think there's also this big question mark, even though these two countries represent maybe 30% of global GDP, it's still, if the other 70% still want to support the system, I think there's still a lot of support of carrying it over. And to me, quite frankly, I think part of the US policy is quite short-sighted because they also need to build a coalition. Right now, there's not much of a vision that they put forward to the other 160 members that are not, or 62 members that are not China and the US, on how they want to integrate them into the system.
I agree with those last points with Nicholas. I mean, you got 20 countries that want to join the WTO right now that are in the accession process. So the one thing that I think will be interesting to watch is when you watch, Chinese US subsidy policy. I was reminded recently by a developing country trade minister that it's great that you guys have the money to do this, but we don't have this money. So the response is going to be very asymmetric. It's going to be local content requirements. It's going to be import substitution requirements. It's going to be tech transfer requirements. It's going to be whatever they can come up with that they can use that doesn't necessarily cost them money because they don't have money, but will, make sure that they see some of the benefits of some of these new technologies, but in a different way. And those are going to come up and then be challenged at the WTO because some of those are, problematic and outright illegal moves that they can make. So it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of shakes out over time. I mean, the other thing I would say is that subsidies are generally incredibly inefficient. So if I'm not incorrect, I think China has tried to subsidize 150 electric vehicle companies or more, with only a couple really being successful. And while in the US we have a venture capital community that also makes bets that have winners and losers, I don't think their track record or they'd be very successful venture capitalists if their bets were similarly skewed as some of the benefits in the others. The other thing that I think is really important is we're moving away in some sense from kind of country to company or firm level trade, where there's a lot of stuff going on in the world today that is much more at the firm level, whether it be subsidies that are being granted, whether it be Tesla negotiating its own tariffs, whether it be export controls and how those are applied. And so it's also a really, and frankly, rules of origin. Rules of origin are on the verge in some places. Rules of origin are the rules that are used to determine when a process is made across countries, where is the largest amount of value coming from, so that you can apply the tariff rate or the rules to that product. They're super important for international trade, but what we're starting to see is rules of ownership starting to come up. So if you have a plant in Mexico that is Chinese, a Chinese investment in Mexico, even if all the production takes place in Mexico, the fact that it's owned by China is starting to catch people's eye, and people want to maybe potentially treat that factory differently than they would have in the past, when it would have clearly been Mexican production by Mexican workers in Mexico, so getting the benefits under the US, Mexico, and Canada Free Trade Agreement. But I think this is going to be an enormous issue in the upcoming renegotiation or review of the US, Mexico, Canada agreement coming up. And I think one last point I would like to make, just Rebecca, if we have a moment, and Nicholas, would love your comments on this as well. I mean, I think that in a world where we have this concept of economic security, and this is about setting up trusted supply chains, particularly in areas that are very important for not only national security, but for domestic manufacturing and the domestic economy. So it's things like the semiconductors work, it's things like biotech, it's part of the green tech work. Critical minerals is also a big part of this. But as we think about economic security moving forward and developing these trusted supply chains, for me, this is where I think going back to kind of the US and Europe, they need to come together to work on some of these things, include a piece of the WTO, how to get that back up and running as part of it. But as we think about these trusted supply chains, I would think that there's, the two blocks or the two economies that would really need to come together and work together are going to be the US and Europe. And looping all the way back to this electric vehicles point, that's why I think that it's important that both the United States and Europe have worked together on this China e-vehicles issue, even if the tariffs are at differing levels, because it shows that they're coming together on some of these economically important economic security supply chains in a way that could lead to future cooperation in other areas.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think also from a European perspective, we are really at the beginning of defining our own economic security strategy and our instruments. And we're very much far behind the US in that sense, both in terms of strategic thinking that I think was always much more developed in the US than at least at the European level. It's different in different member states, but basically having like a European-wide foreign policy is still something that we sometimes struggle to establish. But also Europe doesn't have the same kind of institutional arrangement that the US has, for instance, especially when it comes to foreign direct investment screening, export controls, and sanctions. And I think we can see with the case of the sanctions we put against Russia, how powerful that can be when Europe and the US works together. Europe by its own would not have been able to do any, just a fraction of what we able to achieve together. At the same time, also part of the financial infrastructure, for instance, when we think about the banking, the financial, the SWIFT and the banking sector, might not also been possible for the Europeans, which support part of this system. And we can see, despite difficulties that we have with sanctions enforcement, that we managed to really cripple part of the Russian defense industry and their financial industry, and we kind of managed to cut them off in many ways from supply chains. But it also shows the parts that we still not managed to do in this kind of section, also shows where we still have work to do. When we think, for instance, about computer chips, we still don't really have a full grasp of what these supply chains are, how they're going. And given that different countries and different economies control different part of this supply chain, it will be very important to build kind of common intelligence about where these supply chains are, where the distributors are, how these kind of sanctions are circumvented, and also kind of how to make sure that these products don't get into the wrong hands. So I think there's a lot of scope here, and there's a lot of benefit and then basic power in if we manage to get these economic, especially these economic things, security issues on a transatlantic level.
When we come back, we'll try and look into the future. So I'm here with Penny Nass, joining us from DC, and Nicholas Poitier in Brussels. And we are talking about the state of global trade with a UK election coming up, possibly before this podcast, which is being recorded in June, even hits the air in early July. We have US elections coming up. We have a new European Commission coming in with the leadership and then the senior officials being chosen later. And we're on the start of a major new era of the EU-China trade relationship. Do you have any crystal ball predictions or things to watch for? I realize that there's so many things that could happen, but let's get out on the edge a little bit. What do you think is coming? Nicholas?
So the first one, we talked a bit about the UK before. The first one will be the UK election, which will bring likely a new government that might have very different ideas about how UK-Europe trade relations will look like in the future. And I think the UK has to bury some illusions they had about the UK-US trade agreement that was never in the cards. But there might be some things they can do with Europe that if some issues are seen less on a less ideological basis. I think afterwards we have, the most important one, which is probably the US election, which really could completely shift the picture. If we have another Trump term, he has said he wants to impose blanket tariffs on the entire world. That would have major repercussions for everyone. We never know with Trump what he means when he says it and what kind of the policy outcome would be, but I think that will really change the picture. In the same time, there are other policy areas where we don't know how a Trump presidency would shape up. It was much more confrontational towards Europe in general, so making trade issues more difficult. But also, we might see not the same type of alignment we have in foreign policy right now, where Europe and US are in many ways pulling in the same direction and therefore being very powerful in economic security and in our policies towards Russia, for instance. But basically, if there's more of a misalignment between foreign policy objectives, as we had with the US and European views on the Iran nuclear deal, then basically many of these things don't work anymore, and we might have also some confrontation there. So I think there's really a lot in the air there right now. I think the other question is basically the other big trend that I'm very worried about, but also I think that will really change the picture in many meaningful ways, is the economic performance of China. We have a lot of at least yellow flashing indicators in China right now, and we have a lot of lights that just gone out, and we don't know if they're if there would be red flashing or yellow. We don't know because there's basically China doesn't publish data anymore, and that would change the dynamic. It would change the political dynamic within China if actually the growth would slow down, significantly slow down, if we have some type of economic crisis there. But it would also change the dynamic of our relationship with China. Right now, a lot of companies generated their revenue and their growth by basically exporting more and more to China. And if that is not the case anymore, if the market is not growing anymore, they will look for other markets and they might be less interested in the EU-China trade relationships. And I guess the same will be true for US companies. And I think there are some other players that will be interesting to watch for the next years. I think India is, of course, a key one. India is still a medium-sized economy, but it's growing very quickly. And there's a lot of interest on Europe and India itself on basically deeper trading relationship. There's trade talks about the trade agreement. This will be very difficult. India is right now a quite closed economy. But if the Indian government decides to open its economy, it could completely change the dynamic in some industries. So I think that's also one that's here to watch.
Do you see China going after specific European sort of emotionally significant industries like cognac, Spanish ham, these very specific, very regional things as it tries to push back against the EU electric car tariffs?
That is what we are seeing already in some of the announcement, but that's also the pattern that we have seen in the past. If we look at what China has done in what's often described as economic coercion, it's basically this. Instead of going after big commodities, which they sometimes also do, but it's very difficult and very expensive to do, they rather go after companies by basically instigating embargoes, instigating public boycotts against them, by creating rules that they're against individual companies, but also by creating rules to harm individual industries. We've seen this as lobsters from Australia. We've seen this with seafood from Japan. We've seen this against South Korean companies. So we have seen many instances of this, of basically this kind of unofficial sanctions against individual sectors, industries, or companies that are used to put political pressure on politically sensitive parts of an electorate in a Western democracy. So I think it's very on kind of. It's not very to be expected, the kind of measures that we have seen announced. At the same time, right now, they're not on a very big scale. So I think it's also, I would not overinterpret what we see right now. It could also be seen, depending on how they implement it, this might also be kind of a weak tit for tat that avoids larger spillover of this conflict into a larger trade war. So right now, I think we had to expect some type of retaliation. If it stays on this level of cognac and pork, I think no one will really get too upset about it. But if we might see bigger escalations if actually these tariffs get into final implementation.
What do you think, Penny?
I think one thing I'd like to make sure we make a point about on this call is the tariffs. And leaving this call, because there's a lot of conversation going on around the use of tariffs and the use of subsidies. Tariffs and subsidies can be used, I think, strategically, surgically, and under certain conditions, usually very specific conditions, to remedy an unfair competition or a dumping practice. Well, not all, I think all anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that are filed are legitimate. There are some that I've personally worked on that were clearly directed action to dump a bunch of products and to recoup funds on certain things. So in those cases, the negative aspects of a tariff, I think, are offset by the action you need to take. But overall, tariffs are a tax. They're a tax on imports and exports that create distortions, that produce negative impacts across the entire economy. They are regressive. They go after the people that are poorest are normally the ones that are hit the hardest by tariffs. And they are aggressive tax. And I think that people think tariffs are this great thing that foreigners pay and it doesn't impact them. But I think that we have to remember that tariffs are generally an incredibly inefficient tool that harms the poorest among us and in our societies, and really should only be used in very specific and very strategic instances. And if there's one thing I can leave people with, it's that please, please, please don't see tariffs as this great political, easy solution to all of our problems that can replace our income tax system. Because I think that people are forgetting that tariffs have had really bad impacts. And I have a number of studies that I can quote and show people that shows what the negative impacts of tariffs are. But that's the one point I would like to leave people with, and what I hope is not in our future moving forward, and that we go back to a world of tariffs between whether it's the US and Europe or between more countries more broadly.
Well, thanks for that. I think that's a great closing thought for today's podcast. We've covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate, Nicholas and Penny, your willingness to go round and round a few times to really try and get our heads into this game, because it's so complicated. And depending on where you're standing, it can look so very different. And I know my understanding has really improved. Listeners can read stuff that Nicholas has written on our website, google.org. You can also find the archives of this podcast. Penny is a frequent public speaker. Her LinkedIn page is where I keep up with her many public speeches and experiences. And of course, with the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund, you can see where she is and what she's up to. And we hope you have gotten something out of your time today and that you will join us again. Thanks very much. See you next time.